we still have our moderator with us. But there's no space. There is space for me?
Good afternoon and welcome to the Graduate Institute. It's a pleasure to have this panel discussion with our colleagues from EUI and to have this discussion in the context of the Geneva Democracy Week. So for those who were with us already yesterday, we have a series of events happening throughout the week in the context of this initiative promoted by the Geneva Chancellery of State. So we are very happy to be part of this initiative at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. And this is also the occasion for us to discuss ongoing projects, to share findings also across projects, and to have discussions with the partners, institutional, academic partners with which the center has been collaborating over the last years or so. And it's our pleasure to welcome our colleagues from the European University Institute in Florence, Martin Wink and Victoria Finn. So I'll introduce them briefly, along with the other panelists who are from the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. Martin Wink is chair in Citizenship Studies and director of the Global Citizenship Research Area within the Global Governance Program at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at EUI. And he's also co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory. It's precisely in this context of the work of the observatory on the questions of citizenship and the mapping of the changes also in the franchise that we will discuss today, that we have been partnering with EUI, and also we had a collaborative project in the course of the last months between the Grad Institute and EUI. His colleague Victoria Finn is a Max Weber Fellow at EUI. She's researching migrant political participation, non-citizenship, and migration governance in South America. Victoria also serves as an elected co-convener for the ECPR Standing Group on Migration and Ethnicity, and she's elected Executive Council Officer for the APSA Migration and Citizenship section. Along with Victoria and Martin, we have three colleagues from the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy who have been engaging in a project on youth participation in Europe, and we would like to also share the project design and preliminary findings in this conversation today. So we have Maria Maxi, who is research fellow at the center and who specializes in future labor markets and social policy. Maria also serves as special advisor to the president of Greece on issues of digital economy, employment, and social welfare. Next to Maria, my colleague Janina Velp, who is a research fellow at the center, who is also editorial coordinator at Agenda Publica and a founding member of Red de Politologues. Sorry for my bad Spanish accent. And Janina has just authored one of her publications, which is precisely on the dynamics of participation in Latin America, and her book is entitled The Will of the People, Populism and Citizens' Participation in Latin America. And this book will be launched tomorrow at an event which takes place here at Maison La Paix at 12:30. So I hope you will be with us as well. And my colleague Laura Baloncasis, who is a postdoctoral researcher and outreach officer at the center. Her current project is the one that I mentioned before, which is entitled Protest and Engagement, from the Global to the Local, mapping the forms of youth participation in Europe. Laura just received her PhD from the Department of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University, and her dissertation explored the social-cultural category of youth in UN climate symmetry, with a particular focus on how current framings of youth impact the lived experiences of young people. So this is precisely one of the threads that we would like to explore today in this conversation across our project teams, across our institutions, as to how political participation takes place, in which spaces, formal, non-formal, according to which modalities, with which objectives, and how does this broad dynamics of participation, how are those connected also with the changes in the political rights, in the formal political rights. So the research work done by Martin and Vicky, along with their colleagues from EUI, is precisely to map these changes in the enfranchisement of people who are non-resident and people who are non-citizens. So it's this first topic that we will explore first with Martin, and in our conversation we would like to see how people get involved in politics, in which ways, and how does mobility also inform political participation and the dynamics of enfranchisement. So we will start with a presentation by Martin on his research, followed by Vicky, who will discuss some practical elements that emerge from her work on how enfranchisement actually works. We'll then turn to Maria on the forms of mobilization among the youth on work-related issues. Then Laura will explore the dynamics of protest and participation in environmental-related politics and policies to some extent, speaking about the project, the collective project, and her own work. And Janina will make some analysis on this relationship between institutions, between the formal spaces of participation and democratic innovations. So this is how we are proposing to organize this panel. So a series of short presentations and then a conversation on the different issues that the different presentations contribute to, and of course, a discussion with the participants here in the room. So that's it in terms of the introduction. I would like to welcome you to this event and to thank you very much for joining and for coming from Florence for this event, Vicky and Martin. So the floor is yours, Martin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks, Christine and the Graduate Institute for inviting us to come from Florence to Geneva. And it's my pleasure to discuss with you the question of enfranchisement, and especially how you might access and lose voting rights, candidacy rights, and present some ongoing work that we're doing within the Global Citizenship Observatory. We'll go through this relatively quickly in the 10 minutes that we have, so this will provide you with a short snapshot. But do go to our website, globalcit.eu, where you can find a lot of the information that I will present. And for some of the information that I will present, you have to wait a little bit because this is work on progress, but this will give you a sneak peek into the data sets that we're currently developing. Okay, so the idea is that I would start with a kind of a big picture approach and discuss the challenge of global mobility. So I talk about enfranchisement and disenfranchisement from an international migration perspective. And the common denominator, I think, between our discussions will be mobility. Right? So international migrants are mobile, but also youngsters are often very mobile. They study in a different place than they are officially registered. How does participation work there? But when we talk about migrants, estimates are difficult, but according to the latest World Migration Report, we have about 280 million international migrants globally. This is clearly an underestimate of the number of migrants. So this is only documented migrants. It excludes temporary migrants. And so this is an underestimate of the migrant population, but this is still a significant amount, 280 million, although in percentages you could say this is a relatively small percentage, lower than 4% of the global population, but what's important to keep in mind is that in some places this percentage may be of course much higher, right? Some origin contexts have seen their population leave en masse, and some destination contexts have seen migrant inflow rise, and so in some destination contexts the percentage of migrants, foreign-born population in a country or a city may be over the 10 or even 20% in some contexts. Now, when we talk about the franchise and democratic institutions, I think the main message of my talk will be that there is a mismatch between the way in which democratic institutions are designed and the way in which the world currently functions, namely the mobile world that we are in, even though during the pandemic mobility was in a way frozen to a large extent, but we also saw the consequences of this. People are frozen at a point in time where they may not be a citizen and may not have all the rights that full citizens are entitled to. So this leads to a lot of insecurity in terms of security, health security, also mobility rights. Can you go back to your country of origin? To what extent are you subject to these restrictions? Now, when we talk about democratic institutions, there's a mismatch with the mobile world in the sense that democratic institutions, they are mainly regulated by citizenship, right? Not completely, and I'll show you where the trend is going, and also by place of residence. So as long as you are a citizen in your, let's say, country of or city of a residence, you typically have full access to the franchise, voting rights for the various elections. But as soon as you either as a citizen move to another country, you will risk substantially disenfranchisement, both in your country of citizenship and in your new country of residence. And so that's the question that drives the research that we're doing at GLOBALCIT, how to ensure the access to franchise for these mobile groups. Now we're looking at this from two perspectives, and I call these here a direct and an indirect perspective on the franchise. So the direct way of enfranchising mobile populations would be through expanding the voting rights, and that's the first data set that we are developing, and I'll show you in a moment the global trend on the preliminary data that we have so far, which is the GLOBALCIT electoral rights data set, which looks into especially two categories of mobile persons. So on the one hand, the non-resident citizens, so citizens who have left their country of citizenship, to what extent do you still have access to the franchise in your home country? And that's of course important, and we know this from all the transnational mobilization literature that people, of course, this whole idea of origin and destination that drives much of migration research is a complete mischaracterization of the sociological situation in which migrants find themselves, which is a transnational constellation where they actually have strong ties both to where they came from and where they moved to, and maybe even to third or fourth places. So the democratic institutions are focused on this stability, but the sociological practice, of course, is much more in flux. So we look at this from two perspectives. People who leave their country of citizenship, to what extent do you maintain access to elections in your country of citizenship? Secondly, we also look at this, so this looks at, let's say, the franchise from an emigration perspective. Secondly, we look at this from an immigration perspective, so access to the franchise for non-citizen residents. So how soon do you have access to democratic participation in your new country of residence? And traditionally, of course, this is through citizenship. You first have to become a citizen, then you get access to voting rights. But increasingly more we see that there are innovations in regulating access to franchise, for example, by access to voting rights, especially at the local level. So access to national level elections for non-citizens is still very much the exception to the rule. The Irish in the UK or the Brazilians in Portugal, so those are very, let's say, idiosyncratic bilateral situations. Now, the indirect way of accessing the franchise is through citizenship, and that's of course the most direct way, but we also know from the whole history of regulating citizenship that access to citizenship is heavily guarded by states and not made accessible to migrants to a large extent in many contexts. So becoming a citizen of your new country of residence is not something that is in most contexts seen as a regular part of the migration process. And so states have to make an effort to facilitate the access to citizenship in order to improve the franchise. And access to citizenship is not the only question relating to citizenship and the franchise. The other question is, to what extent can you retain your citizenship? What happens if you naturalize in your new country of residence? Can you maintain access to the citizenship in order to maintain access to the voting rights that may or may not be tied up with citizenship status? So here we look at citizenship, especially from a dual citizenship perspective, right? And this links again to this transnational perspective. To what extent can mobile people actually be a citizen in two contexts? So we are developing data sets, and we have already some of them online on dual citizenship. A very quick snapshot of what's the current situation. So when we talk about voting rights, we first look at enfranchising non-resident citizens, so citizens who have left their country. And here in this slide present the preliminary data from the GLOBALCIT team that has worked on this. We look at this data set, we exclude microstates for the moment, so states with less than 250,000 people, and we exclude closed autocracies because they don't have any competitive elections, and the data collection is not yet complete, so we at the moment have 55 states in 1960 and about 91 in 2020. Now what you see in this graph is that when you go back 60 years, maintaining the access to voting rights in your country of origin was extremely rare. So only in a quarter of states would you have some kind of access to voting rights, but in 3/4 you would lose, you would be disenfranchised while you move. Right? Now when you move 60 years further, we see actually that the situation has radically improved from a franchise perspective. 3/4 of migrants now have access to franchise in their country of origin, whereas only in 20% of these countries this is restricted. I have to speed up a bit to make sure that I stick to the time. Now when we map this out geographically for the current situation, 2020, we in our data set we distinguish between voting rights and candidacy rights, and you see that this access to the franchise in your home country is more generalized for voting rights and less generalized for candidacy rights, first of all. And secondly, we see that this is much more common in the global north and parts of the global south. The gray spots are ones that either we exclude or we haven't yet covered. But you see, for example, Brazil here, which had the elections on Sunday, and you might have heard that, of course, many Brazilians abroad voted, and that's very much the case. But in Brazil, you can only vote for the presidential elections, but you cannot vote for the Senate, for example. Now, this is where Bolsonaro made big headways, and that's, of course, not because of the expat vote, because I think about 700,000 Brazilians abroad voted, which is, of course, a small percentage of the total number of voters in Brazil, but it can make perhaps a difference in some cases, and also in the US context. In the case of very close elections, as we have seen in the past presidential elections, the expat vote might make a difference. Now, when we move from the emigration perspective to the immigration perspective, so we look at non-citizen residents, we see the same overall trend. So the trend is towards more enfranchisement, so that's good. But you see that also the trend is slower. So only in 50% of countries in 2020 do migrants who have not yet become a citizen have access to local voting rights. And that was in 1960 even much more exceptional. So this is there's a clear trend, but you see also that it's the trend of increasing franchise is flattening in the last decade. So it doesn't seem to move much further. Now, when we look at this geographically in 2020, we see that here the Latin America and Europe situation is one of green countries, so that's where there is access to local voting rights, and Vicky might talk a bit more about this in detail. Whereas in much of Africa and Asia, actually almost all of Africa and Asia, this is not the case. So you have access to local voting only through the citizenship perspective. Now, from a political participation perspective, this is of course important. You could say, well, local voting rights, what do they matter? But there are a couple of political science studies that have, or much of the literature points at the socialization effect of participation, and this is where we might come to when we talk about youngsters. Right? And in this case, from a migrant perspective, local voting, of course, is important in the sense that it makes you part of the political community. And studies have also shown that if you are more likely to have early access to local voting, you're also more likely to vote once you have become a citizen in national elections. So there's a socialization element. So the last empirical slide is on dual citizenship. We see again the same trend towards greater acceptance of dual citizenship. That means that this idea of transnational constellation becomes much more viable. Here we map this out as a percentage of the world population, and now about 50% of the global population has potentially access to dual citizenship. So they have a possibility to be a citizen in both of these contexts. Well, the final message is when we have to take into account mobility in the design of our democratic institutions. When we talk about restructuring democracies as the theme of this week, we have to take into account this mobility perspective and rethink this nexus between citizenship, residence, and rights. Still a lot of work to do on mapping these constellations of rights, and I showed you here the picture of a de jure enfranchisement, and the de facto enfranchisement is of course also an important constellation. And finally, we also need to think beyond this formality and think about what migrants and mobile persons can do outside of formal participation. There's of course also a lot of informal participation. So thanks to my colleagues, and that was it from me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think you already made the transition to Vicky's presentation about from the jure to de facto and the actual practices of participation among migrants.
Great, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you to Christine and the team and Michelle and everyone for organizing and inviting us here today. So exactly that. I'm Vicky Finn, Max Weber Fellow, and kind of my background is on migrant voting rights and then migrant voting as in turnout, and mostly in the South American context. So I'll be kind of taking from this general sweep and talking more about the legal and political aspects of enfranchisement and then disenfranchisement, as well as then getting into some individual level behavior. So then the following presentations will talk more about the youth participation. So basically, we talk about participation a lot, but it's quite complicated to put it into law. So most of the suffrage or the voting rights that we see are first in constitutional law and then in electoral laws. So for migrant enfranchisement, there's 3 basic steps from, as in the legal process. States have to enact, which is pass regulation, and then regulate it, and then implement it. So we see a lot of countries doing maybe 2 of those steps and then never actually letting people vote in elections. So it sits there on paper but is never implemented in practice. Or, for example, the electoral laws are really complex and complicated at the registration step or at the actual voting, which prevents participation. So these things are really important to think about when we actually look at the laws, which is why the databases give you a snapshot, but then you have to go in and see the within-country variation and then how that changes over time. So these are, I'll get into the graphics in a second, but this list is a few of the things that decision makers have to decide when making laws on migrant voting. So as the maps that we just saw, is it local voting? Is it regional? Is it national? Is it a mixture? Can they vote in plebiscites, referendums? All of this is defined in law, of course, and then it depends on who's voting. Is it universal in the sense of the entire group gets to vote, or only certain nationalities? So the easy one in the EU nationals can vote in local elections in another EU member state in which they live. But third country nationals cannot, so this is a restricted part of that law. And they typically cannot vote in national level elections. But in the South American countries, a lot of immigrants can vote in multi-level, which means they can vote in all elections. For example, in Chile and Ecuador, after 5 years, you can vote in all elections. It does not matter if you've naturalized or not. And then immigrants, the same thing, the overseas vote. How do you count the votes? Do they go towards a new constituent? Is it the last region that you lived in? You know, where is that vote actually going? And then is it by post? Is it electronic? There's a lot of decisions around how to regulate. So in the electoral laws, the rules of how to actually register and then cast a ballot. And is it only immigrants, people who have lived in that country? Or is it also their children, or third generation, or fourth? Or like, where is the cutoff? So all of this list is defined in law. And because there's different steps in continually implementing it, at any time a state could reverse back or not implement the immigrant vote in one of the elections. So it's not a linear process. So when we see the expansion, if you look closer within countries, there's fluctuations of an incumbent not letting the immigrants vote or blocking it somehow in practice. So this is why I think we're taking, we have the global data, and then we take case studies, and then we look at actual situations to see rights in practice versus what's on paper. So yeah, as you can see in the graphic on the left, I know it's fuzzy because I stole it from Google, but this is at the top, the Brazilians that live abroad who potentially could vote in the elections on Sunday. So it's a growing number, and then kind of the description below shows which cities that they're living in. So, both states and societies are interested in seeing the potential turnout numbers, and then as the votes are being counted, everyone's interested in knowing which cities and which countries do their co-nationals are voting, like what's their vote choice, to see which candidate is winning where. So you can kind of find migrant voting and enfranchisement in the news a lot. It's just maybe overlooked. And if you're interested in migrant enfranchisement or disenfranchisement, a quick shout out to a special issue coming out in GEMS that I'm co-editing later this year with some special case studies of disenfranchisement, especially in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I won't spend any time on the literature, but if you're interested in why this happens, why enfranchisement happens or is taken away, direct to number 3, there's a lot of work done on global norms, policy diffusion, as again the maps, and over time we see, why is this happening? So there's plenty of written on that if you are interested in more like the theory or the conceptual part. And then from the political science side, the last point, number 4, basically just incumbents granting rights when they think it's going to be in their favor. And on the other side, blocking the law or implementation when they think that they will not win more votes, basically. So I'd like to spend the second half of the presentation talking more at the individual level. So what is making people participate? So again, I'm going to deal with migrant voters because that's what I do in my own research. So at the individual level, we're talking about a single person, and with the spread of enfranchisement rights, as we just saw, people are more often facing 4 different choices, which you can see in this graphic. So the first is to participate as an immigrant. So this means that you move to a new country, you get involved with politics in that residence country, and this is immigrant participation. At the same time, you still have ties, connections, your original socialization in the origin country, and you can still participate from abroad. This is immigrant participation, and as Martin mentioned, it's very intuitive to understand transnational ties, and you're obviously still living in between 2 different places. So this is where the transnational aspect comes in. And so the dual transnational participation is when someone is participating in both countries. And of course, there's always non-participation. So we don't want to overspeak. I mean, this is the concentration of our presentations today. But many people just don't participate in politics, which I think is why we're interested in why youth especially are participating or not participating and kind of how to instigate it. So non-participation is certainly just as big, if not bigger, for migrant voters than other voters. But those that do participate I found in my own work that trust, ties, and belonging are very important, but also they play out differently for migrants. International migration is inherently dual, and it has a duality because of this transnational aspect. But the non-participation, if we think about it, and especially in this context, and thinking about Democracy Week and having rights and then accessing them, and people who want to participate and who are prevented from doing so, this is a very important line of research. I usually refer to it in the voting context as abstention versus prevention. It's really important to look at the people who want to participate and who have access, but yet can't get there. So the people excluded in practice is often very targeted for example, where you live, sociodemographics, your religion, etc. So there's a lot of easy ways that parties or states can prevent voting. And basically, an easy institutional barrier is just making it more difficult during the registration or the voting process, like requiring more documents, requiring a document that you can only get in person over 3 months in the origin country, things that are exclusive for like rich mobile individuals, or who easily eliminates the second generation who hold nationality, but they ask for a different identification to register or vote. So like you might end up at the electoral table with the right to vote, and then you don't actually get to cast a ballot. And this would be the same as in other forms of participation. But sometimes, the non-voting you can still do in a more informal way. So I'll leave it on this slide to kind of lean into the next half of the panel. But kind of some thoughts for reflection, putting migrants and youth together. The political motives behind migrating are also increasingly important. So, I'm of course thinking of recent Venezuelans or other types of migration that you might have left without having all the proper documents that one would need to then participate in formal ways. And especially interesting to think about is the 1.5 generation. So these are kids or adolescents who move with their parents, who are socializing politically in 2 different countries, and also have a lot of influence of their parents' political socialization, especially when the motive for migrating has something to do with, for example, climate or political regimes. So, what's going to happen with their participation and their turnout and vote choice? And then how are they deciding to get involved in other ways, protests or movements? And it's not just in the residence country, but it's also back or like as part of the diaspora towards the origin country, or mixing both. And these are just not voting, but also we see more and more youth are more important, care about education and abortion and other rights, thinking ahead through their future. So I encourage you to think about, youth migrants, but also they care about obviously more than just whatever is bound within the national territory, that it's more global, and that can be the origin country or beyond. So I will leave it there in the interest of time, but please feel free to connect online with me as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Vicky. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
Which one it is, but
Yeah.
they're all there.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to have our colleagues from beautiful Florence and to present the findings of 2 important projects. And we are trying today, it's actually the second event. The first event was last December in Florence, where we conducted a joint workshop. And now this event, and the purpose is to explore synergies. So young people is the focus of our research. A research project we are running at the Albert Hesman Center of Democracy with my colleagues Christine, Laura, and Janina. And we are trying to see how young people become active, the various forms of participation in two domains, climate and the environment, and the world of work with a focus on the gig economy. And our research is comparatives. We are studying 3 countries, Switzerland, Spain, and Italy. 4 countries. France, sorry, yes. Yes, France as well. So I'm focusing basically on labor issues. So today I'm going to present to you a couple of findings in the area of the digital gig economy, which is the focus of our research. So I will first start by looking at definitions. What is the gig economy? Any reactions? Costas? I'm sure we are all familiar with the gig economy. I'm sure you are familiar with platforms like Uber. I'm sure you are familiar with platforms like Deliveroo, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and similar other digital applications and platforms where people, via these platforms, perform gigs, short-term assignments. This is the digital gig economy. Now, the gig economy, of course, is a little bit broader. It is composed of all type of freelancers who perform short-term assignments, either in the digital world or in the analog, the traditional world, as we call it. So, if you are a communication person, writing an article from time to time, writing articles for a magazine, then you are a freelancer, you belong to the gig economy, right? In our project, our focus is the digital gig economy because it's a new phenomenon. It started rising 10 years ago with all the proliferation of all the digital platforms and the applications. And it's actually growing. And the thing is that the digital economy, as you can see there in the figure, is very popular among young people. Many young people aged between 16 and 24 years old work in the gig economy, either as Deliveroo riders or doing small things via platforms like translation of books or editing or similar type of assignments. And why young people why young people like the gig economy? Because of flexibility. Flexibility, the gig economy offers you flexibility. You can work as freelancer, you can determine your own working hours, you can perform this kind of assignment, drop the other assignment, you have the flexibility to determine the way you are able to work, when, and how. But on the flip side, there's a problem there with the gig economy. Kostas, our ILO colleague, we have been working on the topic of social dialogue in the gig economy. That's why I'm referring to Kostas all the time. And the problem, especially from the ILO perspective, is precarity. So gig workers have been experiencing a lot of precarity in the gig economy. Earnings are lower than what workers in the traditional economy get. And the thing is with the gig economy is that when you are a gig worker and you're working for a platform like Uber, for instance, Uber claims that Uber is not the employer. Platforms, digital companies claim that they are not employers, but what they do actually is connecting consumers with workers. So by saying that we are not employers, then we don't have any responsibility to pay unemployment insurance, paid maternity leave or paid paternity leave, and workers are deprived of all these social protections and benefits that workers in the traditional economy actually enjoy. So there's a lot of precarity. And when there is precarity, how does this connect with the political participation realm? What happens? Well, two things happen. Either you go for a populist vote, or you resort to activism and protest. So this is what we have found in our research. So we have found that young workers feel more and more disappointed. They feel that because of this drive towards casualization and precarity, they feel more and more disenfranchised. At the same time, another important and very interesting research that was conducted in the UK shows that gig economy workers were those who actually voted for Trump in the US and supported the Brexit movement in the UK. So we have evidence showing that when you experience precarity in the labor market, there are clear connections between what is happening in the labor market and how this precarity, how these precarious workers express themselves either at the ballot box or in the going to the streets, right? So, concerning activism and protest, there was a very interesting ILO report completed in 2021, which shows that over 2017 and 2021, more than 1,200 incidences of platform worker protests globally occurred. So we have seen that basically, on the one hand, gig workers support populists. That's not the norm, okay, but it happens. And on the other hand, they resort to activism and demonstration, and also to legal action. They go to courts and to strikes. And the ILO report has tried to identify via interviews the motivation, the reasons why gig economy prefer to demonstrate, and that's because of anger. All these grievances in terms of in relation to their working conditions. And if you want to see the global map of labor protests by gig workers, you can see that there is a lot of activity in Europe and also in China. And actually, it's the United States where we have the highest number of protest events, but also in Argentina, China, India, and the United Kingdom. And with all these protests, gig workers targeted, the majority, they targeted a single platform, but at the same time, they protested against multiple platforms because gig workers work for multiple platforms at the same time. So basically, this is my presentation, short, but I think that it is very informative in the sense that it clearly illustrates the connections between the digital world of work and the world of politics and the world of political participation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria. So from the issue of work, we move to the issue of climate and environment with Laura.
So I'm going to sit down for my presentation. So hello everyone, I am Laura Bolinkassis. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Hirschman Center. And I'm going to quickly dig into the nexus of youth, climate, and disenfranchisement. And I'm going to speak about three dimensions that are related to the nexus between the three today. So first, the roots of this disenfranchisement. Second, what young people report finding in forms of political contestation, such as protest. And third, I'm going to focus on some institutional responses to it, specifically one interesting example which is based in Paris. And so to do so, I'm drawing on my current research as part of the comparative project that I am doing here at the center with Maria, Janina, and Christine that has been mentioned on the connections between youth protest and democratic innovations at the local level in 4 European countries, but also a little bit of my PhD fieldwork on youth participation in climate conferences. And so both of which are really heavily qualitative, based on semi-structured interviews and participant observation, which is why my slides are really sort of pictures I've taken in my fieldwork, and they're mostly illustrative of what I've seen and experienced in this fieldwork. So disenfranchisement takes many shapes in the nexus of youth and climate. It's at the roots of movements like Fridays for Future, the sort of Greta Thunberg-inspired movement that began in 2019. And on the screen, I've displayed a picture of my fieldwork at COP25, the climate conference, UN Climate Conference in Madrid in 2019, where Fridays for Future staged a walkout on its last day to signify their discontent with the proceedings. And many in the crowd, if you were talking to them, were suggesting that they had no intention to ever come back to a global climate conference. So what are the roots of this disenfranchisement? So first, there is a temporal nature in climate change, which means a loss of agency for young people who cannot be active yet in politics. And because of their young age, they will bear the brunt of climate change the most. So this resonates with claims of intergenerational injustice and with many of Thunberg's speeches. I'm thinking about the relatively well-known now How Dare You speech, which he delivered in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Second, it can be found in the loss of faith in political institutions and their ability to respond to the immense challenge of climate change. So this is particularly pronounced actually in the last year or so, with many young activists leaving the Fridays for Future movement altogether, feeling discouraged after a couple of years of attempting to kind of create political will and institutional change, and arguing that from what they've seen so far, there is no path forward with informal politics. So for that reason, what we're seeing now is that the movement is knowing a very fast turnaround speed. If you attend Fridays for Future protests today, you're going to see very few of the people who actually began with the movement just 3 years ago. It's an entirely new set of young people. And arguably, all social movements have a much faster turnaround than any kind of political party or formal politics. But with youth and climate, what you see is that young people often leave youth movement fairly quickly, to either join movements of civil disobedience, like Extinction Rebellion, or are at loss as to what to do next. So third, even if they are still keen on participating in formal politics, they report frustration in their inability to act at the appropriate level of governance. And this kind of resonates with some of the previous presentations. Climate change is a global issue, and yet they are national citizens, only able to impact, if at all, a particular jurisdiction. This is often why they choose to attend climate COPs and engage at the global level, for example, but they still report a lot of frustration there. Even COPs are designed to encourage political lobbying based on citizenship. You will get access to your national delegation, for example, much more easily than you would another one. And fourth, arguably, many are not rights-bearing citizens yet. We're talking about a movement that is full of minors, who experience this disenfranchisement before they turn 18 and are able to vote, even. Some of them report that they feel excluded from formal politics in other ways. For example, you need to be more than 15 oftentimes to even get an internship in a political party. You need to be 18 or more to participate in a climate COP. If you are below that age range, you need a chaperone. So there's all of these hurdles that impact them even as minors. So I would, however, caution to see protest as just a result of disenfranchisement or as a deepening form of disenfranchisement. It can also be a place for re-enfranchisement in a way. I recently attended the Youth for Climate protests. This is kind of an offshoot of Fridays for Future in Paris on 25 September. And speaking to young people in the crowd, They explained that for them, protest is where everyone is included, regardless of age. It provided them with a sense of community, of like-minded people too. They also underlined that protest for them is not necessarily confrontational. It's where you kind of meet the other in the street, where anyone who crosses its path can join or ask questions. Also, protest can be mimicked, it can be exported, also responding to the transnational dimension that is at the heart of the climate politics. That said, even protest can lead to disenfranchisement for some youth. There is often, and perhaps justifiably, the claim that the youth climate movement is exclusionary, that it is white, that it is middle class, that it is urban. And so a whole segment of youth are feeling disenfranchised from those movements as they don't recognize themselves and their worries in them. And in climate COPs, this was very obvious. You'd have, for example, young indigenous peoples who would describe the privilege of presenting yourself as youth that they don't have, right? Instead, because of their race or their ethnicity, they felt like they had to foreground other, sometimes more contentious identities, like their race or gender. So as part of our project on mapping youth political participation, which we've mentioned, we've begun identifying spaces where there is a response to this disenfranchisement. And one example I want to highlight today is the Climate Academy, l'Académie du Climat, in Paris, France. And this is for two reasons. First of all, it's an institution that was created specifically as the mayor of Paris's response to the 2019 Fridays for Future protests. And second, because it has an interesting approach to responding to this disenfranchisement. So the Academy has a clear theory of change, which includes sort of meeting young people where they are. And the way they sort of conceptualize youth, they divide them into two segments. Those who are already engaged in climate politics, so the climate activists, and those who are not. And for the first, they give them spaces to meet, to organize, to host events. It's kind of an institutional home. And for the second, who often come from perhaps less privileged backgrounds, they're targeted through their own interests. For example, through the nexus of climate and sports, or through offering them training in green jobs or skills, which will help them on the labor market. So the Climate Academy is an educational space, but it's also a space for young people to find a new kind of institution that they can trust. In an interview with the director, she described it as an institutional ovni, so just an institutional oddness in a way, suggesting that their main challenge is to rethink the institution as a space, as a non-prescriptive space. And they have what she called a qualitative methodology, which means that they're constantly gathering feedback from young people and adapting to it, rather than having something really fixed that they kind of offer. And so here the institution is in constant evolution. They also specifically initiate working groups to work on Paris-based politics. Here there's a flyer that I took a picture of, Donnez votre avis sur la ville de demain. It's a revision of the sort of climate urban plan. And then 15 young people, for example, here ended up submitting their recommendations after working on it together for a few months. And finally, they also have a ripple effect on other institutional settings. Through their work and their lobbying, they have made, for example, a module on climate education mandatory in one of Paris's universities, thus furthering climate education in the city. So this is not to say that this is a perfect solution, but perhaps it can be food for thought in terms of how to approach youth disenfranchisement and climate politics from an institutional perspective. And so this sort of leads to the next presentation on democratic innovation.
Thank you very much, Laura.
So yeah, good afternoon, and my thanks also to Vicky and Martin for being here and to all of you for participating in our event. I will talk about the relation between democratic innovations and youth participation, and in doing that I will start by explaining what are democratic innovations, what do participatory institutions respond to, an assessment of the outcomes, and then finally I will focus on youth participation and democratic innovations. Yeah, first point. What are democratic innovations? I think the concept, and this has been a huge discussion for years in Europe, in Latin America, and in the US, on this idea, democratic innovations, which I think is a big misunderstanding, but is so spread that at the end of the day we are all still using it, and it's very difficult to change that. Because what means democratic innovations? I mean, a democratic institutional change is also related to change the laws on elections, as Martin and Vicky explained. And the idea of innovation refers to the novelty, to something new. But when we talk about democratic innovations, the idea basically is what in Latin America is defined as participatory institutions or participatory democracies. So the idea of these democratic innovations at the end of the day is not dealing with all type of institutional changes, but with particular institutions and procedures addressed to engage citizen participation. And I think this is a very, probably something which deserves more attention, because this idea of innovation is also a kind of marketing idea, right? It's better because it's new, and no, not necessarily. And we are seeing that many institutions which could be absolutely new, or absolute also is a controversial thing, are not really answering to the problems they are expected to answer, on the one hand. And then also, we are talking of new institutions which in fact are not new at all. For instance, now we are facing a spread of recall referendums everywhere. Geneva introduced that last year. And in fact, it's one of the oldest institutions in the discussion, the theoretical discussion and the regulation discussion. This was discussed in Philadelphia in 1787. So it's very old discussions, and if we go to these very old papers, we can see that some of the arguments against and in favor are the same, or quite similar, I would say. It's not always the same, and of course I don't think that things are not changing. But anyway, let's focus on this idea of democratic innovations as institutions of political participation, participatory institutions, and then one step forward on that is also relevant to see that there are many different institutions. When we talk about participatory innovations, it looks like an umbrella and is all the same, and it's not at all the same. And we can see also in the debate, in the current debate, in Europe, for instance, now the sorted assemblies, the assemblies selected by lottery, following a demographic criteria, etc., are like mainstream. These are on focus. And we can talk a lot about that. This is not the focus of this conversation today, but it's quite easy to see that are popular because on the one hand, it looks like quite radical in the sense that normal people will be deliberating about politics, ordinary people, this, for many actors, social movements and some, especially social movements, this is key. But for the political power, it's not really challenging because the decision is in hands of the traditional institutions, and we have seen this as part of the problem. But then we have the mechanisms of direct democracy. We can talk, of course, about the definition and the different typology. It's not the same a president, in the Latin American case, for instance, activating a referendum for increasing his power, introducing re-election, etc., than a model such as the Swiss one, which is also similar to the one in Uruguay, where what is regulated is citizens' initiatives, so citizens through signature collection can change the constitution, or mandatory referendums, which yes or yes should be called if there is a constitutional change or an international agreement, for instance, on climate change or something like that, highly relevant. And this, interestingly, is not on top in the discussion now in European countries. And I think that Brexit, for instance, is used to just avoid this discussion with the idea that it's not working well. But in fact, it's not working well, but it's not what we are talking when we are talking about empowering the citizens. The Brexit was called without the appropriate regulation by the party or in the government to solve an internal problem more than to resolve the policy-making issue, which we have seen took much longer, and there wasn't a second or a third referendum as we could have expected if the idea was to have the people decide. So yeah, when we talk about democratic innovations, the first point is to see that it's a very complex set of different institutions which are addressed to what? Second point. What do participatory institutions respond to? In theory, and even in theory, there are contradictions, because in the 80s, when these democratic innovations started to spread, the main idea was to fight against apathy. The electoral turnout was going down, affiliation to political parties was going down, and the idea was to introduce a mechanism mainly at the local level, then some at the national level. But again, if you look, for instance, if you take referendums, mandatory referendums, and citizens' initiatives, in Europe, only very few countries have this regulated, particularly citizens' initiative. The Netherlands introduced it for 1 year and then they quit. Was an interesting experience. Then Italy, Switzerland, and San Marino, Liechtenstein, and then the Eastern countries. So this is also interesting. Martin spoke about the changes and the mismatch between, and what we see is that institutional change is produced mainly not in stable situations, but in situations of crisis. So we find these interesting mechanisms in the Latin American countries with the restoration of democracy, and in Eastern countries also with the third wave of democratization. But then we can go to Vicky's point on the difference between having this in paper and having this in action. Because there are many countries with very good regulations, very interesting regulations, but then there are many ways to block it, and it doesn't work. It happens, for instance, in a country such as Costa Rica, where according to our research, there are like dozens of attempts, and they are all blocked for something, which is a point here. But yeah, one point was the apathy. But then more recently, it is completely different to talk about the democratic fatigue than to talk about anger. And we have seen recently that these institutions, not the referendums, but for instance the assemblies, the citizens' assemblies, or the national dialogues, we have seen this in Latin America quite frequently, but I think one of the first was the French experiment, with a very concrete answer to a social upheaval. No, the yellow vests were burning the country, to speak like in an extreme way, and then, yeah, the first reaction of the government is try to repress that. It doesn't work, then we open a national dialogue. But a national dialogue, and then we do what? I think I'm not against these national dialogues. I think are very relevant, but if are attached to some other forms of political responsiveness and even accountability, because some of these assemblies now, yeah, we have a lot of very good recommendations. Recently, I was in Austria, and one of the launchers of the Citizens' Assembly for Climate Change said we had a very good process, a very interesting debate, but then nobody cared about the results. So how can this be connected to the policy making? And this is one of the challenges. So yeah, my third point was the assessment of the outcomes, and I already went into it. The main criticism is that most of these institutions are not working well. for many different reasons. I mean, for manipulation in the case of the referendums, which are more prominently activated top-down by presidents or governments, but not by the people, or because are criticized for being smoke screens. And people perceive that. Laura said that in Madrid, many of the people you spoke with said, we won't go back to one of these events because it's not meaningful, it's not relevant for policymaking. So when we go to the relation between democratic innovations and youth participation, I think all these confusion, let's say, and challenges and problems to somehow are exacerbated. And some problems are also, in my view, in the same definition of what is youth participation. With Laura, we were recently in the Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy in Lucerne, and in a workshop, there was an exercise, and a group of people suggested what do you want to do more, what do you want to do less, what you have to stop. And one of the young representatives said, stop with the idea that the youth are the future. And we were kind of, what does it mean? And it means that as soon as you say the youth are the future, you disqualify them to discuss now. They are the future. We are dealing with this now, we, the non-youth. And this paternalistic view is part of the problem. Also the definition, I think, because when we talk, for instance, of sorted assemblies and the criteria, I think the age, generational criteria is important, but the youth, to what extent are a group and to what extent not? As you said also, there are many, in the gig economy, probably the protest, the profile is quite different from the profile of the ones engaging in the climate change protest. It's quite different. So there are much more diversity, and also this idea of having youth participation probably reinforce these paternalistic views and the isolation. Let them speak. Yes, let them speak, but then what? And speak with whom? I mean, this is the big challenge. So, summarizing, I think even if here we had like quite different presentations, it's interesting to see how some of these headlines I took go in the same direction. No? Again, Martin stressed the mismatch between how institutions are designed and how the world works. And I think this is absolutely relevant for all the presentations, for all the discussions with the gig economy, probably particularly, but in general. Then is also this issue of finally we arrive to have a constitution, a law, some kind of protection, but the enactment is something else. And it refers to the institutions, and yesterday we had a great event also on that. We can have rights protected in the constitution, but then there is a judging that. And look at the states now, for instance, how this is changing. And then Maria spoke about this flexibility, precarity, and how young workers feel more and more disappointed and move to support populist leaders and to protest. And I think this is also highly relevant for the discussion, because laws are changed when there is a requirement, when there is social organization, political organization, and this lack of well-structured discussion makes what Laura said at the end, that young people leave movements quite quickly. So I would say that the scenario is quite worrying, because the answers are coming too slowly, are not really accurate, and in this process, in the social environment, people and particularly young people, is moving to support radical projects which are attacking democracy, and all this, I think, should invite to rethink an agenda for what the democratic innovations and in general social protection, etc., should be to really prevent these trends, which are, I insist, really worrying.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all these very insightful, interesting presentations, and also for the links and the linkages that we really see between the work in progress of everyone here on this panel. So I think we are quite, we start from kind of a similar a starting point, which is the challenges that you have been mentioning of apathy and disenfranchisement. In disenfranchisement, both de facto and de jure. So I think these kind of perspectives that you brought also help to understand how institutions are in a way approaching those challenges. Also the dynamics which are shaping those challenges, mobility, both international but also internal. And I think there is also a point there about mobility within regions, and we mentioned the EU, for example, which had these innovations in terms of granting local voting rights. There is also this, I think, an important point which emerged is the kind of multiple levels of governance and of democratic innovations that have happened. We saw the local level with the example brought by Laura. We mentioned the EU as well, so a supranational kind of thinking of how to enfranchise citizens, but not necessarily all residents, and this is one of the challenges that your research also shows. So I think it's also very important to locate those political processes and this institutional driven changes against the backdrop of the challenges and the work-related ones, which in turn are shaped by mobility and do shape mobility, as Maria showed, and also the climate and environmental challenges, which trigger participation. So I would ask you a common question, actually. Could you just identify, for the sake of our conversation, our debate, a few elements that, according to you, trigger change towards a more active political participation? So that could be something that we also could reflect in tandem between our research groups. So I think this notion of what triggers changes is important both from a more sociological perspective and also from a sociological approach, but also from an institutional one. And I think what we saw today is really this the space in which both the people's and youth participation meets the institutional response or the institutional proposals to kind of open up more space both for formal electoral rights and also for participation, including for people who have not yet reached the electoral age, or people who have not yet or who are not eligible to electoral rights because they are migrants or because they are not in the demos recognized institutionally. So yeah, the question about what triggers change could be one that I would like to address to all of you. I would also like to see whether there are any questions from the room. I'd be happy to give you immediately the word. So maybe you could start, Martin. So what triggers change both in formal or de jure or de facto?
Thanks, Christine. Well, on the voting rights, so this has been mostly studied by political scientists and political economy. So I can say a bit more about the literature on what we know about this. And I would say, generally speaking, so there are at least two approaches. So one is focused more on supply and demand, and one is focused more on norms. Actually, Vicky mentioned also the norm, so maybe I leave that the norm to you. But so diffusion argument, but on the supply and demand. I would say the idea that so first of all, some groups have to ask for participation, so you have to stand up for your rights, right? I think that's important because if as Vicky said, migrants may not have a direct interest, and so then they are not asking for participation or electoral rights, and then of course rights will not be granted, right? And in the big context of, motives for migration, voting rights may not be on top of your agenda, right? So, I'm a political scientist, so I think about voting rights quickly, but typically this is maybe not the first part that people think about. But of course, for long-term settlement, this is important. So people have to ask for this, and that's what we see. I mean, now, last week, so I'm a Dutch citizen who actually works in Florence, but I'm officially a resident of Portugal. So I'm an expatriate, immigrant Dutch citizen, and I received an email last week from the municipality of The Hague that manages the voting register for the Dutch abroad, and actually we got an additional right. So we are now. I used to be able to vote for the lower house, but now I'm also able to vote for the Senate, which represents the provinces in the Netherlands. But since I'm not a resident of a province, I could not vote. But there were some people in the diaspora abroad that lobbied for a change because they felt that, since we have a bicameral system in the Netherlands, actually it's important that, and the Senate becomes increasingly important because the majority in the lower house becomes more fragile. And this is the case in the Netherlands, but it may also apply to Brazil, right? Where actually yesterday we heard that even perhaps Lula might win the second runoff for the presidency, but Bolsonaro won the Senate, where the Brazilians abroad do not yet have the right to vote, and that may be problematic, right? So people might ask for this, and potentially this might change, and this is how this happens often, that people lobby for change. And why this happens, right? So first you have to ask for this, and secondly, you need to convince people, right? And here I think it's easier, typically speaking, the external voting seems to go easier than the immigrant voting, because external citizens, they are citizens, and politicians are more willing to listen to them, especially in the external voting literature. There's a lot of attention for the economic power of the diaspora, right? So David LeBlanc has called this harnessing the diaspora, right? So origin countries are interested in the economic power of the citizens who reside abroad, for the remittances and so on. And research has also shown that countries that accept dual citizenship or that have external voting are also more likely to receive more remittances. So a paper just came out by Bellman et al., colleagues from the US, that launched a new data set in this area, and they rerun some of these analysis by David LeBlanc, and they also show that actually giving external voting rights increases remittances, and they show that this is not about de jure voting rights, which is often part of a symbolic politics, but actually about de facto enfranchisement. So only when you actually organize elections and make sure that people can register somewhere and then have access to the vote, right? But this keeps the link. Maybe the last thing that we could say from the immigrant's perspective. So the main argument that seems to potentially convince people, I think partly for a large extent it's about party politics, right? So that of course explains change, but there's a big literature on the citizenship premium, so how citizenship for immigrants in a way improves their socio-economic and socio-cultural integration in the labor market and in participation, and of course active participating immigrants can make a greater contribution to society, right? And so that's what, I'm not saying that this always convinces politicians, but that's at least a part of what people ask me, right? When I do research in this area, they ask me to do, politicians who want to make a change, they ask me to share my research on how citizenship can improve the labor market situation of immigrants and therefore benefit also the receiving society. So, kind of concrete benefits in this case. I could say more, but I'm stopping.
Thank you, Martin. Vicky?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if you want to take more questions or if I should also. Of course, I have lots of things to say on the question. Just to follow up, I guess, in the missing pieces of what Martin just said, what triggers changes, I mean, at the different levels. So I think we're all commenting, like, in local spaces and at individual levels, and then migrant organizations, and then political parties. I think we haven't talked a lot about, but they're certainly relevant in making changes. And a lot of that is responding to the claims making, the demands from either individuals, or different constituent groups. And whether those people are abroad or not, migrant organizations have become larger players in gaining enfranchisement for people, because it's basically just a collective of individual voices and then putting pressure on a political party to introduce a bill to Parliament or Senate, or any kind of pressure to make it into a bill that might be passed as law. So kind of this chain, I think we see a lot. So both migrant organizations and political parties are certainly relevant actors here. And then political parties also have huge motivations to instigate mobilization. Especially we see there's a great edited volume that came out on this last year. But the presence of different types of campaigning abroad versus, if you look at one political party branching out to reach people abroad can be much different than reaching out to people who live within a territory. So these different connections, I would say at different levels, are kind of what triggers change often. And then also I just wanted to say about the states can also take that inclusionary lens and also do, for example, social campaigns to make people aware of their voting rights. Very simple things like, do you know that you can vote after 5 years here? That's really all it takes sometimes to if we're looking at low participation across the board here. In the South American cases that I work on, many people don't know that they have voting rights. So this is also problematic. Or if a state has just implemented, Chileans only started voting a few years ago in national elections from abroad. So it's getting the word out to when you need to register, how you need to do that. If it's automatic, where you need to go, or if the ballot will come to you. It's a lot of logistical information that needs to reach people to even interest them in maybe participating. So there's a lot of work that political parties or organizations or states can take to get people to participate. Because we always kind of think that people always want to participate, and that's very much not the case. Sometimes people generally say they're interested in politics, but they need a little bit more of a push. And in this work here, we're talking about young people who want to participate and who are blocked in other ways. But then there are other people who, need a bit of a push to get involved. And I think a good example also is the local level. Belonging at local communities is way different than national belonging or connections with the state. And with the migrant voting, it was just kind of spread across the news in the past couple of years in the US. And even though immigrant voting was widespread a century ago across the US, and then it kind of dissipated in the 1920s, and now some states allow it. So if you look at federal, countries, it's easier to see smaller things happening, or involvement in school boards or in cities. So there are different levels of. So I think all of those are the major players and different institutional spaces that people start getting involved in, and then encouraging people to get involved in other ways too.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Maria, what is your take on this?
Well, I liked a lot what Janina said. She mentioned democratic fatigue as the reason for all this, behind these various forms of participation, right? Democratic fatigue, meaning that I guess that democratic institutions are not functioning as they should. They don't deliver in accordance with their scope and purpose and role. And this is very important in the world of work, because the protests I mentioned, most of the majority of the labor protests were organized by gig workers themselves, self-organized groups, not trade unions. So trade unions seem to be a little bit alienated from what is happening in the real world of work. So, and trade unions, we know that it's an important institution, it's part of the social partners, it's part of our democratic system. So if we need change, positive change, I guess, we need to address the issue. How we can make our institutions more representative and more inclusive. And the other thing is that, okay, trade unions are not, a bit alienated. Then you see the populist vote. I mean, young people vote for the extremes. So it means that traditional parties do not seem to not to represent the people as, they should represent young people and young voices. So I think that these are the two areas I would insist on, and I would prioritize as important domains where we need to work a little bit more and trigger change.
Thank you. Laura?
I'll keep it brief because I feel like I touched on this quite a bit in my presentation, but I feel like coming from the nexus of youth and climate, the question is not so much what triggers participation, but what kind of participation. And maybe what will be worth is to take a little bit of a step back. The history I presented in my presentation is very short, it's sort of 2019 to now. But if you step back a little bit more and you look at youth and climate over time, you see that for, I'm going to say, the last 30 years since the Rio Convention and sort of since civil society groups became sort of a recognized category in climate negotiations, for example, the first sort of thread in youth participation was very much about carving out a space for youth, straight up. It was non-existent. And it actually came really late. It's only in 2005 that there was a recognized youth presence in climate conferences. And that sort of then trickles into more sort of national settings as well. But it kind of came late. And now it seems sort of obvious because youth is everywhere. It's so tied and connected to climate discourse. You sort of assume that it's a really well-recognized category, but it really wasn't until recently. I mean, the category and the sort of presence of business was recognized before the category of youth in climate conferences. So I think that was sort of the first push of participation. You still see it in national settings and local settings, young people wanting space for younger voices, for youth. But I think that there is a move away from that increasingly because, Janina mentioned, sort of tokenism, there's also youth washing, there's all these different mechanisms through which youth just kind of loses its power and then nothing really happens out of these spaces. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of fatigue there and a desire to see results beyond identities such as youth. So I think the boundaries between the movements are also very sort of in flux. As I said, it's sort of a changing scenario. I feel like every time I return to the fields and what I do, it sort of changed a little bit. And now I'm seeing more and more young people leaving the youth space and moving towards executive rebellion, as I mentioned, or nothing at all, and there I really wonder what's going to happen. So I don't have all the answers. All I know is that it's in flux and it doesn't look like what it looked like 15 or 20 years ago, or even 3 years ago.
Thank you, Laura. Janina?
Very, very, very interesting points here. I think the question evolved a bit. We started with what triggers institutional change, and then we moved to what triggers political participation, and it's interesting to look at how these two connect. No, it's like, political participation is a kind of clear point that we have on the one here, the question of why people participate in formal electoral politics, and they have to feel that it's meaningful in some way. I mean, it's basic. Or that there are coaction. No? In some countries in which it's compulsory, you have to pay a fee or something if you don't, but that's part of the answer. And then we have these other forms. And it's anger, right? It's when you engage in a protest, and I think it's really interesting to connect the two questions, because then how we move from political participation to institutional change. In normal politics, we can feel that is not so needed, or it will evolve like normally or naturally, and in periods of crisis, it's not like that. So then it's the connection between these movements, and it's interesting when you talk, Laura, about extinct rebellion, because I think the connections then are there. Because if you want to introduce institutional change, you need connection with the ones who are in charge of doing these reforms. Or you have to create a party and then win elections and introduce the changes, or you need to create some teams. And these movements, which move radically to the other side, also produce a narrative which is not really inclusive. It's very hard to follow. Some of them, I'm talking in general, of course. So this is part of the discussion. I mean, we are running out of time, but I think to look carefully at what happened in Chile recently could illustrate a lot this debate.
Great. Is there any final comment or question from the room? Oh, sorry, Declan.
Well, just to pick up a little bit actually on what you were saying just now, and apologies if this is one of the things you said you didn't have the answers for, but something that's come up quite, just sort of alluded to today and also in our work is this question of belonging for young people and how critical that is, you know, that sense of identity. And it seems to me anyway that some of these new, which might not be quite so new, innovations around democracy and participation do provide that opportunity for young people to have a say, take part in something. But they're not structured, they're sort of one-off even, and they don't speak to that question of identity and foster a sense of belonging. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how some of these new ideas, citizens' assemblies, for example, can be structured in such a way that they don't just provide that sort of opportunity, but also foster that sense of belonging and identity, whatever that identity might be. But any thoughts you have on that would be interesting.
Yeah, it's a very good question, which I don't have I have a quick answer, but it's not a good one in the sense that I think something we have to work in is this idea of a political community, belonging to the political community, the goals of the community, which doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything, but does mean that we need to agree on some basics of what defines our community as such. And this is a bit lost. I think this the identity politics, and it's a very difficult conversation because it's producing a lot of division, is important in producing a lot of reparation, but it's really negative in eroding this idea of a political community. When you speak from your position in terms of gender, ethnicity, age, etc., and a person who doesn't share your characteristics is not allowed to have a voice because can't understand, because it's not. So, as I said, it's not a clear answer, but it's my feeling. I'm going around this idea of what means belonging. And I don't think belonging means belonging to the community of the youth or the females or we need these agrupations to promote some particular politics, but the problem is with the notion of political community.
Lucy?
I think you want to wrap up, no? I can also discuss informally then.
I
I have two questions basically, but I can ask them another time.
If you can make
Okay,
them short.
Very briefly to Laura, I was wondering how does legal action from the state and repression shape these involvements, because often these young people are actually burdened by legal procedures. So how does that enter the picture? And I wondered if you had looked at that. And then about participation, I wondered if there was a link to be made between Janina's talk and the one of Maria, and asking, so how do people have the time to get involved in participation in, our labor markets, which are very time consuming and leave very little time to these kinds of involvement. So these were.
Would you like to make quick
I'll just make
points?
a quick response. This dimension came up more for me during my fieldwork at climate COPs because it's also a global setting. And so speaking especially with activists either from the global south or for countries that are sort of semi-authoritarian or what have you, they would describe Fridays for Future as a primarily Western phenomenon because they can't quite express their will in that particular way. I mean, there's going to be police repression and what have you, so that came up quite a bit. And also, I would say in the West, when there is repression, it can actually be galvanizing for movements. And I've seen that as well. Youth telling me that, because this happened, well, now they're, doubling in sort of effort and maybe you're changing tactics and it sort of fuels something, maybe the anger that we've been talking about. So I think it sort of takes different shapes according to context and sort of settings, but it certainly is a big factor for sure.
On the second point, okay, we'll continue the conversation, but thank you very much for your questions and for these points, which are important to our ongoing work as well. So thank you very much to the panelists for sharing their insights on their research. It was very interesting, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you for joining this session today, and we look forward to seeing you at other events of Democracy Week and other events at the Institute in general in the next months. Thank you and have a good afternoon.